At this point, I'd like to introduce Joe Aquino. And so Joe is a director of sustainability for Pinnacle Renewable Energy. Joe and I worked with some scientists on putting together a greenhouse gas study for Japan, and Joe will be presenting the results of that now. So Joe, over to you.
All right, thank you, Gord. So as Gord said, I'm the Director of Sustainability for Pinnacle Renewable Energy. So for the purposes of this project, I'm representing WPAC, so Wood Pellet Association of Canada, and its members across 2 jurisdictions, so Western Canada and also the Southeast US. So we're giving a holistic approach on this study. I think it's great that we're having an opportunity to share information like this, despite the circumstances that we're facing with COVID-19 not being able to meet in person. So I think, kudos to everybody putting on this event, and I think it's important that we continue to share information like this despite our circumstances. I'd also like to take a moment just to thank the other presenters. I think there's been some really good points raised throughout this event, and I think the focus on sustainability has been encouraging, and I think it segues nicely into this study that I'll be going over here. So just a quick overview. What we did with this study is we looked at greenhouse gas emissions as they relate to wood pellets being manufactured in Western Canada and also the Southeast US, because there is WPAC membership based out of the Southeast US. Sailing on sea vessel journeys and heading over to Japan to be used in the power facilities there. So, that's a quick overview. The intent is that it's going to provide some insight in terms of what that looks like from a GHG emission standpoint. So I want to talk about why we did this. You guys have heard about METI from previous presentations, and METI is the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan. And what they did was they commissioned a sustainability work group specifically to look at sustainability criteria of biomass that's being sold to Japan and used for power production. The main goal of METI, of the sustainability work group, is really to uncover whether or not biomass being used for energy is contributing to a positive climate outcome. So they looked at various components of sustainability, everything from forest certification, as you've seen in some previous presentations, forest management practices and the risk analysis associated with that, feedstock types, and a whole host of sustainability information as it relates to biomass. And leading to this study, specifically, they also looked at GHG emissions and what that looks like from a climate benefit standpoint. So really, it became apparent that the Japanese market was demanding some sort of characterization of biomass that was being sourced from BC and sourced from various places in Western Canada and other large pellet producing regions, and being used for energy production. So that's really the focus of why we did this study. The study provides a well-rounded overview of all the supply chain emissions that are associated with pellets being sold to Japan. So what's included in the study? So we looked at data from 17 pellet mills in Western Canada. And we also looked at, which is not being shown on the map here, but we also looked at 2 pellet mills down in the Southeast US. Again, they were WPAC member mills as well. So all companies that are WPAC members participated in the study by allowing us access to their data as it relates to feedstock sourcing, as it relates to production and processing techniques in each individual mill, transport data, and every component of the supply chain before it reaches Japan. So basically, the study is a complete picture of WPAC membership, which I think is exciting. Okay, so let's take a little closer look at the methodologies we used and the data sources that we used to pull the project together. So one benefit, as you saw from Gord's presentation, is that there's a lot of forest certification in Western Canada. And also there's biomass certification, which is associated, which ties to that forest management certification. All of WPAC's members have SBP certification in Western Canada and the Southeast US. So SBP certification played a key role in this project by formulating the data that we used to characterize the GHG emissions. So just a little closer look on that. The information that we pulled is from the Sustainability Audit Report, one of SBP's requirements for certification. It's commonly known as the SAR report. And what it does is it provides a convenient way to collect GHG information using raw data, using raw consumption data. In addition to the format of the SAR, which is very convenient for pulling information and plugging into calculations and conversion factors, it is audited on an annual basis. And so in terms of the credibility of the data, there's confidence that the SAR data and the background data going into this project is third-party verified and is audited on an annual basis, essentially leading to the fact that the project is credible and defendable to scrutiny. So one piece on the conversion factors and methodologies, I think there's a lot of discussion around, how conversions are applied and which methodologies are used. What we decided to do for this project is we decided to use existing conversion factors and existing methodologies developed by the JRC, which is the Joint Research Center in the EU. So they've done a lot of work on, researching how a kilogram of biomass converts in terms of GHG emissions. There's a lot of background calculations in that. They've done a lot of, conversion factors on how fuel relates to GHG emissions and how fuel being used in things like locomotives for rail or transport for trucks is also being converted to GHG emissions. And so, there's a lot of work there that was already done. And, since Japan was not at the stage where they had sort of developed that methodologies themselves, we decided to use what was already existing. It is credible in terms of it's endorsed by leading scientists across the industry that their work is dedicated to uncovering the contribution that different types of fuels make for GHG emissions. So you can see the calculation on the screen, the equation. This is really the basis of how we define supply chain emissions for biomass. So the first component is emissions, and emissions equal the emissions from extraction and cultivation of feedstock, plus the emissions of land use change, so emissions that are created from any land use change, or the carbon stocks associated with that land use change, the emissions from processing, and that would include production and any sort of other processing that's affiliated with pellet production, including storage and handling. The emissions for transport and distribution, so that would cover moving wood pellets from processing facilities to storage and handling sites, and also the movement of those wood pellets on sea vessel from storage and handling sites to the end users in Japan. And Lastly, they would add the emission factor, which is given to utilities. It's a non-CO2 emission factor, and it's given to utilities as they burn wood pellets. So they basically have to live with an emissions factor that is given to them. It covers non-carbon, so it would cover things like Gord mentioned, that small amounts of other compounds that are released when you burn carbon or wood pellet or biomass-based fuels. There's also some other components where you can turn this calculation, instead of looking at just emissions, you can actually subtract some savings. And so the first savings is the emissions savings from soil carbon accumulation, minus the emissions savings from a carbon capture and geologic storage, minus the emissions savings from a carbon capture and replacement. So for the purposes of this study, I'm focusing on the emission additions, not the subtractions. We don't do, there's not really subtractions that are really implemented at scale in Western Canada. And so, there's not any components of the supply chain that are worth mentioning in that regard. So we're really focusing on the additions. And in addition to that, we're only focusing on the components that are associated with feedstock, with processing, with transport, and the utilities. There's no land use change factors that are associated with sustainable feedstock going into wood pellets. So I'm just going to jump right into it here, and I'll walk you through a simplified version of this. Keep in mind there's a lot of calculations that are happening in the background. What I'm showing you is I'm showing you the results, and I'm showing you the default values that are used for each of the components of the supply chain. And what we've done here is I'm showing you an example of one of the 17 mills. It's an unknown mill, but what we did was we picked, just for the purpose of this presentation, to illustrate to you how the calculations are applied and how we've measured each individual facility. We've picked one which is essentially representative of all the facilities feeding into the pool. So the pie chart that you see above is essentially the components of the supply chain where there's values associated with them. And the first one that is elevated from the rest is emissions from extraction and cultivation of feedstock. So if you look at the table below, you see the components of the feedstock category. So you have forest harvesting residues, stem woods, and logs, which is essentially round wood. So this would be like any pulp source. This would be like Gord was showing in his presentation, the low quality wood, the crooks and the cracks, and the pieces that don't make sawlog grade. Also, we have forest residues excluding stem wood. So these will be the tree tops and the branches and the limbs that are collected at roadside and often are burnt if not utilized in the wood pellet industry. And then we have sawmill residues. So as you can see, this particular mill had a breakdown of 22% roundwood, 6.7% stem wood, which would be the forest residues, and 71.1% of sawmill residues. This is a very common feedstock breakdown in Western Canada, and is very representative. So simply what we did there was the default values that are associated with each of those are from the JRC values that we talked about, and they include GHG emissions associated with extraction and cultivation of those various components. The forest residues don't have any cultivation component to them, and the breakdown of that material is covered off in the processing phase, which I'll point out later. And sawmill residues only get a small portion of the cultivation fee. So you can see sort of how that's broken down from the forest to sawmills. And essentially it's a weighted average based on the proportion of feedstock, which gives you a grams of CO2 per megajoule of pellets for each feedstock category, and gives us a total of 0.591 grams of CO2 per megajoule of pellets. That's the unit we're using. It's a conversion of calorific value per ton of pellets or per kilogram of pellets, which then gets converted to megajoule of pellets. So the next stage of the supply chain is the emissions from processing. There's a lot here, but what I will highlight is that this incorporates every type of fuel that's used in the production and the breakdown of feedstock, including storage and handling as well. So, for example, a pellet mill will have a diesel mobile equipment. That fuel use is incorporated into this chart here. It'll also use propane. There'll be some natural gas factors. There'll be, an electricity component that have gone into the production and the processing of those pellets. And then there's also the biomass that's used for drying. In this particular facility, it uses biomass as a fuel for heat. And it also incorporates the supply chain emissions of procuring that biomass and the emissions components that are associated with burning that biomass to dry your feedstock. So you can see that it incorporates every possible consumption point of fuel and gives us a really good overview of how much fuel is going into each segment of that processing phase. You'll see we ended up with a total of 1.771 grams of CO2 per megajoule, and it is the second largest contributor to the overall emission factor. So the transport phase, this one's pretty straightforward. Really what we did, and I'll go into a little bit more detail around the sea vessel, but just to cover off diesel and power, the diesel piece is really just rail movements. And it's also the movement of raw materials being trucked to the facility. So it covers off any sort of transport where diesel is used as a fuel source. And what the JRC has done is they've developed a bunch of conversion factors that convert liters of diesel consumed, the quantity of feedstock or the quantity of pellets that can be housed in a truck or housed in a rail car. And they've expressed those grams of CO2 per megajoule of fuel use in a way where we can apply those conversion factors to the scenarios that are being faced by each individual pellet mill. So that covers up the diesel. The power piece is pretty straightforward. There's no electric trains or any sort of electric trucks that are being used at scale right now for transportation, but that's what that would cover. There's no value there simply because we don't power any sort of transportation modes via electricity. The heavy fuel oil, there's a little bit more behind it, this value, but it's the same concept as the diesel in terms of, we've taken heavy fuel oil, we've taken sea vessels and the size of the sea vessels and other factors such as, the distance that the sea vessel has traveled. And in this case, what we looked at is we looked at Prince Rupert to the port of Kashima. So Prince Rupert is in Western BC and Port of Kashima is one of the furthest ports that a vessel would have to travel from Prince Rupert to Japan. And we looked at a few different ports in Japan, but the key point there is that, there's very little impact in terms of whether it was the port of Kashima or the port of Ikuni or any other ports in Japan, because the impact of that distance had very little impact. So what we did for the purposes of the study is we just used the furthest port, but we also looked at all the various ports where wood pellets are being brought into. The distance was 4,153 nautical miles, which converts to 7,691 kilometers. The cargo capacity we used was 28,000 metric tons, which was essentially a handy size vessel and a common size vessel that you see going into Japan, just based on the ports and what they can handle. And a 35% backhaul ratio, which is a common ratio that's used as a default value. It gives some recognition that some of those vessels are heading back with other fuels and or with other products in their holds. So lastly, and I won't spend a lot of time on this particular factor, is the emissions from the utility. And this is, like I said, it's a non-CO2 emission at the power plant. It's applied to all utilities using biomass, and it's something they have to live with. So we've applied it in our project to get a full picture of what the emissions look like. So let's put this all together. So really what we did was we've taken those individual data points from all the mills, the 17 mills and the 2 mills in the Southeast US, and we've proportioned them based on the volumes that are being sent to each of the ports. So the proportion of volume coming up from Prince Rupert versus the proportion of volume coming out of Fiberco, and weighted the emissions performance of each of those mills to those ports to Japan. And what we've come up with is we've come up with a grams of CO2 per megajoule of 9.40 coming out of Western Canada. Now, just to put this into perspective, coal harbors a grams of CO2 per megajoule of 112.3. So biomass is essentially, 8.37% of coal, or essentially like, a 91% savings compared to coal, which is a compelling figure. The main reasons why coal is so much more, I think there'll be some, thoughts around this, is really has to do with how coal is viewed in terms of it being fossil CO2 as opposed to biogenic CO2. I think Gord described it great in his presentation, where biogenic CO2 is already part of the atmosphere, whereas coal, a fossil CO2, which is coal, is extracted from the atmosphere and added. And just to kind of close it out for the Southeast US side, is we have approximately a 21% savings compared to coal. And really what this means is it's the sea journey component that increases that percentage from 8.37 to 20.1. So just to conclude, why I think this is a great study is it showcases that, hey, using all the same information that everyone's using across the industry today, BC has one of the lowest GHG imports into Japan. And the reason being is it's got one of the shortest voyages that a sea journey needs to take in order to ship pellets to Japan. And so, it's compelling in that respect. We also have one of the lowest electricity values in Western Canada, and this goes to how the conversion factors were developed. And one of the reasons why we have positive electricity values or lower electricity values compared to other regions is the high proportion of hydroelectricity generation. So hydroelectricity generation doesn't require any fossils, and so in terms of the conversions that are applied to processing around that, it would be a lot more beneficial. And then just in terms of, our quality of pellets that we produce in Western Canada, what we saw was across all 17 mills, there was a weighted average of 18.045 gigajoules per metric ton, which is quite high in terms of industry averages. And so just in terms of how those CO2 factors are applied in the grams of CO2 per megajoule, there's confidence coming out of Western Canada that, they're getting the highest possible conversion factor from those pellets. So that was a very quick overview of what the GHG emissions study contained. There's a lot of background calculations, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that with some questions. So let's hop over to question time for Ellen, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Joe. That was a really informative presentation. We've got a lot of questions, but I don't think we'll have time for all of them, unfortunately. Let's just start with this one. Have you considered the emissions from open burning for the pellet plants that are using forest residues as feedstock? The BC government reports on slash burning in the BC GHG inventory?
So we did incorporate the emissions factors for biomass that's being used to dry feedstock. That's really the only component that we can control as it relates to the wood pellets being shipped to Japan. In terms of the emissions factors that are being produced from forest residuals, the way I view that is if we have opportunity to collect those forest residuals, use them in wood pellets, and capture that energy, we're essentially double savings those GHG emissions, because we have no control over what gets burnt at roadside in terms of those emissions. So the more access we have to those types of fiber, the better result in terms of a greenhouse gas performance we're going to achieve.
Right. Okay. We have another question asking if the study is available publicly, and they note these are the best numbers that they have seen. So.
Very nice. Thank you for that feedback. So the study is not available publicly at the moment. I think what we would probably need to do is we would probably need to format it in a way where we would have greater visibility in terms of how those conversion factors are applied, and provide some noteworthy factors that would provide a reader with enough information where they can draw conclusions themselves on how the results were formulated. This study was really just in its preliminary stages. We really just completed it, weeks ago. So, I would say stay tuned in terms of it being publicly available, but it's not at the moment.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time that we have, but any other questions, I'm sure Joe can take the time to answer those, or you can send him an email.